So welcome everyone to the today's Eclipse OpenJ9 hangout. Just a reminder that to please update the Google Doc with your name and affiliation so we know who's joined the meeting. And then I think today we'll kick it off by reviewing the agenda and action items from the previous meetings. The first thing on the docket then is we have some carried over action items around the release plan. Jonathan, have you been able to update the 0.8 release with these items?
Yes, the only one that's still pending is the list of languages, and that's because it depends on how we want to list those. If we look at the overlap with specifically OpenJDK, then there's 10 languages. It depends on if we want to list the whole 18 specifically for Eclipse, or whether that would be confusing and we just want to list the 10 languages. What do we want to do there? I can see, for example, that it also differs depending on JRE or JDK. So, for example, I can see on OpenJDK we've got Chinese simplified, traditional. We've got English, French, German, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Spanish, and Swedish. So there is an overlap there. It just depends on what we want to actually cover.
I think we should probably list all the languages that OpenJ9 itself has been translated into.
Okay, cool. Okay, I'll put that one in there. But the others have been updated. So we've dropped AIX. We're differentiating between 8 and 9. Please take a look. And if you've got any comments, let me know.
All right, thanks, Jonathan. Just going to make a note that we should list the 18 languages OpenJ9 supports.
When you said limitations, what did you have in mind there?
When I said limitations. Sorry, limitations on 8 versus 9 or?
List the languages OpenJ9 has been translated into and the limitations.
Sorry, thank you. The limitations were that the translations are based, the initial translations are based on the last time IBM did a translation cycle. So there are probably some messages that have not yet been translated.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So now that we're in the open, it'll be a different philosophy, but we can cover that later. So it won't be necessarily IBM, presumably, that's doing the translation. Now that we're in the open, it's going to work slightly differently, but we'll need to discuss that.
All right. So the next item is the managing the OpenJ9 issues. So I had an action item to identify component maintainers for issue triage. What I've done is I've sent out an email to the OpenJ9 mailing list and I've included names that I believe have volunteered in the past for this. If I'm incorrect on that, please respond to that email and we'll get the names updated. If there's others who would like to volunteer to help with that, the more names, the better. It lightens the load for everybody. I believe that is action item is complete at this point. I will mark it green. The next item there is yours again, Jonathan. Have you been able to track and report on the issue backlog?
So I've within the minutes I just put 175 open, 221 closed. That doesn't really represent very well our backlog because that contains the JEPs, that contains features, that contains issues. Do we need a set of queries there that we can just run and then report on those?
Sounds like a good idea to me.
Yeah, because I think very quickly we could take that completely out of context. So I think just those high kind of figured numbers aren't going to give us what we want. What's our overall objective here? It's essentially to presumably track JEPs. We can then understand how we're getting through those. But again, that will depend on particular versions of Java. So Eclipse OpenJ9 supports many different versions. So I think we'll need a way of representing that. I think, yeah. You say track and report, but I think there's some extra things that we've really got to think about here and evolve as time goes on to understand what the best way of handling and managing this is.
So I think it's more than just JEPs. I think we need to keep track of the number of issues we have open for a couple of reasons. If that list grows too long, it becomes hard for anybody to find anything in that list to see what's relevant anymore. We end up with stale issues that just float around. So I think we need to be aggressively closing them when they're not relevant. And one way to ensure that we're doing that is to keep tracking that number to make sure that it's not growing unsustainably.
Yeah, but the point I'm making is that I think it probably depends on the type of issue. So just to go back and reiterate on that, we've got a lot of different things. So that 175 open, they are JEPs, they are features, they are issues, they are actual problems with the code, they are all sorts of different things. And I think we need that classification. I know that we've got the tags, and we could just report on some of those key tags, but I think we've got to agree on what's important for the project to manage. JEPs definitely, defects definitely, and I think there's some others as well. But I think also we've got the differentiation between, for example, JDK 10 versus 11. We've got some JEPs which are different between those two. So I think there's just another piece of work there that we've got to do to agree on what we want to be monitoring and managing, and what's important at the moment, and that might evolve through time as well.
So one of the things I don't think we've done a super great job of doing is highlighting issues that have been raised by people in the community, right? Like people who are just using OpenJ9 ran into some kind of issue and raised it at the project. I think we want to make sure, like that to me seems like a very important thing for us to track and make sure that we're either making progress on or addressing or like figuring out the person's problem if we can. Just to make sure that we do as much as we can to help this community grow. I don't think we've done a great job of tagging issues like that. Like we use the sort of consistent tags that we use for everything else, but they get kind of mixed in with everything else.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And those are the things that I think we just need to capture and make sure that we're prioritizing. Yeah, good point, Mark.
So Mark, are you suggesting a special label for those possibly?
Yeah.
User label maybe?
Yep. Or, I don't know what to call it.
User raised maybe?
Yeah, I don't know how long you want to make it, but.
So that's interesting because, okay, user rate, everyone's a user. But are these more of issues found when running against other open source projects, for example? I guess typically people in the field will... Sorry?
That's a subset of them. I mean, we have a bunch of people in the community that we know of who are developing on OpenJ9. We open issues all the time for various things that we're fixing that we know of, and that to represent the work that we're conducting on the code base. But there's a group of people, hopefully a growing group of people who are downloading the binaries and just using it to run their applications. And some of those people are having problems and opening issues. And I think we should highlight those to the project so that we know which issues those are and make sure that we're spending at least some of our resource on looking at those things, or at least understanding how long they're what's happening with them. And you're right. I mean, some of that will be
I was kind of
other open source packages, and some of it will be people using their own applications, and there's a lot of different categories of that. But I think broadly speaking, that's an important set of things for us to be tracking.
Yeah, and that might come down to, I'm just thinking aloud now, that the different classifications. You don't get FE types of tests. You're testing something specifically, a particular interface. You've got kind of more of the system testing to make sure that things kind of work. But then you've also got the application testing So you've got an application, you're running Java against it, and you're finding defects in Java. That's kind of the 3 levels of testing that you can kind of go through depending on your space. And whether we want to tag those differently, or whether we want to, well, these defects are more important because a particular type of user has raised them, I don't know. Do you see what the point I'm trying to make? This is more kind of end user.
Well, I mean, first step is just to tag them all consistently so that we have them all. And then I guess, I don't know that we would necessarily, they're all problems at some level. I mean, we should be applying some sort of prioritization to it, but I don't know. Does anyone else have an opinion on that? Should we break it down more?
I'm worried about the overhead of trying to break it down more. I think keeping a 2-level breakdown there of things reported by people using the binaries versus things our testing and development have found is a fairly easy division. The more we break that down, the more work goes into trying to maintain tags.
Right. So why don't we just start with just one bucket and then go from there. And if we decide that we need to break it down more because that's going to help us, then we can do that.
It seems reasonable. Mark, can I ask you to make that end user level?
Sure.
And Jonathan, from our discussion, you had proposed a set of queries. Can I ask you to create an initial set or initial proposal of what those should be?
Yep, sure. So I think we've got a slightly better idea of what those are from this conversation. So I'll pop those in the list.
All right, thank you. The next item on our agenda had been JEPs that Peter has added the queries here, so I'll mark that green. So Peter had created an initial set of JEPs that are targeting 11, 10, and 9 to make it easy to track which ones matter for OpenJ9. Jonathan, you were going to review the JEP issues and provide any feedback to Peter on whether more detail or content was needed in these?
Yeah, so I took a look at those. I've looked through. I can see they're classified. I'm happy with them. I think that thinking back from the previous meeting, there was some observation that we wouldn't necessarily raise everything, and that was because not everything is applicable to Eclipse OpenJ9. So that looks good to me. I think at the time I'd made a recommendation for someone like Simon Rushton to also review them too. I don't know if he's on the call. Yes, I think he is. Simon, have you had an opportunity of looking through those too?
Sorry, having trouble finding the unmute button there. I'm independently going through the JETs from the OpenJDK website, and I'm kind of 2/3 way through that list. I have a slightly different angle from the OpenJ9 as to why I'm looking at them as well, though. So I've spoken with Peter, and I understand what he's done, which is take the look at the JETs which affect OpenJ9 or potentially affect OpenJ9 in some way, and agreed that seems like a good plan. Is there anything else you were hoping from me from that?
No, that's fine. As long as there's no complaints. I went ahead and created a bunch of Java 9 JEPs. I have a few more to create, but I'm creating all the ones that affected OpenJ9.
All right. Are there any other comments or discussions on the JEP items? Okay. All right. The next item here is just, I don't believe there are any action items here unless there are suggestions for a better name for a label other than blocker to indicate which issues would block a release. And actually, while I'm reading through this, the PR describing, or the pull request describing the release process has been merged at this point. The next step there will be to create a test branch a test branch to test the release process to make sure that it's a reasonable approach and works with the extension project. Sorry, I'm just taking a moment to update the document with notes.
You mentioned release milestone and GitHub.
Go for it, Peter.
So we found a GitHub feature where you could create a milestone. So we created a milestone called release 0.8 to correspond with this release and added a few issues to it, including one of the blockers we had earlier, which has since been resolved. Just FYI for anybody who didn't see that.
So the next item from the previous meeting was machines. Just mentioning that we didn't have ZOS and AIX machines at Adopt yet in the JCK pool, and that we don't yet have AIX machines supported yet. Mark, there's a note here that you've been pursuing getting AIX machines.
Yeah.
Is there any update on that?
Yeah, so Shelley and I and Kishore, I think we now have funding approval to figure out how to move the money from one hand into the other person's hand. And I think we're just going through the steps of getting everything kind of set up on the IBM side of that. And once that's kind of finished, we'll be able to start adding those machines into the open pool. So I don't have an ETA for that, but I would guess it's in the next week or two. It probably isn't that far away, but we can keep tracking it. But hopefully we'll have AIX machines soon. I think we have ZOS machines, right? We just don't have them in the pool yet right now, or a build working. Is that right?
Yeah, I believe that's the case.
Yeah.
There's a bit of machine setup work there required still, and some build.
Good.
Is that not also the case with the AIX machines? Because we don't have any internally either on Jenkins. So there's some machine configuration work here that probably should get tracked.
So are we talking about machines at Eclipse OpenJ9's CI or at Adopt here?
I'm talking about either because I think the process to configure them is going to be very similar using Ansible.
Yes, so I meant from what Mark has managed to get some money for.
So my statements are for Eclipse OpenJ9 and OMR as well. But,
Okay.
We'll have to
Thanks.
go through the same process, I guess, for the Adopt OpenJDK to see if we can support them with more AI machines. And those machines are going to have to be renewed on a yearly basis. Basically, that's the best we could do in terms of commitment. But we're hoping that we can just keep rolling it forward each time.
Is that a calendar year?
Pardon me?
Is that a calendar year?
Oh, yeah.
January to December or from a day? But although it does happen to be January.
Yeah, yeah, it'll be pretty close to a year if it's not a year. I don't know what it will actually work out to in terms of there'll probably be a DOU which will spell out all the details. I don't know what they are right now.
Okay. All right. We continue to need to get x86 machines for Linux and Windows. I know there's been some discussions on trying to find ways to get those machines through UNB. I'm not sure what the status of that is right now. Does anybody else have any updates on that?
I haven't heard anything recently.
All right. Oh, there are no action items left when I look through this, the remainder of the minutes. So I think it's probably worth moving to new items. Is there anything new for today's call that anybody would like to bring up?
So there is one item that I think we should be thinking about that we could discuss for the next meeting. And that's really around how we increase awareness of these meetings. Is there anywhere that we can tweet that we're not tweeting at the moment, just to widen our net? What else can we do to attract attention to these meetings so we can get more involvement and more participation, really?
I guess tweeting is one thing that we haven't tried. So far, we've used channels to advertise.
We could go onto the J9 website. There's nothing there currently. If we've got a stable schedule, then there's no reason why we shouldn't advertise it there.
Yeah, that's a good idea too. Yeah.
Sue, can I ask you to put that together?
Will do.
So I guess kind of along the same lines, I was going to make a suggestion that maybe we add we hard code a section into this meeting around an open request for feedback from people who are using OpenJ9, and make sure that that appears obviously in the agenda and in the meeting notes. You know, just so that even people who don't attend the meeting will see that there's a section there for that, and then we can maybe try to reach out to a couple of people who have engaged at the community over the last few months to see if they'd be willing to join one of the calls and just talk about what their experience has been like, or if they have questions or feedback, like just kind of an open call for input and feedback using G9, so that we can try to start build some more engagement here.
Who controls the OpenJ9 Twitter account? Because there doesn't seem to be much activity on that at the moment.
Did Tony get control of that from Ron, I guess?
I may have the password for that. I have to dig up.
It's just the last thing that's on it seems to have been from October. So if that was a bit more lively, it might get people involved in something that they would actually see and get the message out there.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I guess we could even also kind of another way to try to build some more engagement on these things. You know, we talked earlier about having a user report label, which I've created now. And I'm just going through the issues and tagging ones that I think fall under that category. Is we could include that list of, like, a query for that list of things, and maybe focus on having a little discussion in the meeting around that, like those particular issues, or pick one for each meeting and discuss it or something like that. Like if there's one that's had a lot of activity over the week or 2 weeks or whatever since the last time we've met, we could pick one or two of those to kind of go through in this meeting and just kind of give a summary for for everyone. And if we know that ahead of time, we could even invite the person that opened that report to come and something like that.
It's a great idea, Mark.
Kind of starts tying these things together a bit, I guess. I'll probably end up tagging a couple of issues inappropriately as user, well, inappropriately. There'll be some people who've opened, people who are developers in the community who opened user-like reports, so I'll probably tag those as user report as well, just because I think they'll be of interest to people who are curious about the user experience. So as an example of that, I'm thinking the issue 967 that Keith opened for very slow startup on Windows subsession for Linux without -XMX option. Maybe not an awesome thing to highlight being there, but I think it kind of counts as a user experience kind of issue, unless somebody drastically disagrees with me doing that. All right, well, I'll tag, and then if people feel strongly that something shouldn't be tagged, feel free to remove it.
All right, thanks, Mark. We're rapidly coming up on the end of our time limit for this. Is there anything else anybody would like to discuss on this call?
No from me.
So the only other thing I can think of is scheduling for the next meeting. That would be February the 7th. I won't be available to run that call. I'll be traveling at FOSDEM or JFocus. So can I ask somebody else to take over running? We may need to generate a different Zoom link for that in that case. Peter, would you be available to run the meeting next week?
Yeah, I'll be here.
All right, then unless there's any other comments at this point or items to be discussed, I think we'll call it for this week. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.